So in the video today we're answering a viewer question because Bleasy asks us, how did the ancient Romans manage to build perfectly straight roads hundreds of miles long? The ancient Romans were a people famed for their architectural prowess, something no better demonstrated than by their ability to build almost perfectly straight and incredibly durable roads spanning expansive distances. For example, in Britain alone, the Romans built over 50,000 miles of roads, with the longest ruler-straight stretch spanning over 50 miles. They did all of this in an era without modern surveying tools, construction equipment, or even very accurate maps of precisely where their destination was for many of the areas. So, well, how did they do it? To begin with, it's important to note that there were a few different types of road that were made throughout the Roman Republic and Empire, and the exact method and materials used for road construction varied somewhat from region to region and evolved slightly over the centuries. With that caveat out of the way, the three main classifications of Roman roads were via terrani, essentially dirt roads often made by people walking and wagons riding over the same path over time, via glarii, which was a dirt road that was then gravelled, and finally, much more interestingly, via munitia, which were more or less paved roads, some of which have survived through modern times. With these types of roads, there were further classifications based on who could use them, such as public roads, military or state roads, and private roads constructed at private expense and for the owners to decide who they allowed access to, and this could perhaps be the general public or perhaps just a select few. To help pay for them, roads of all types often had tolls, particularly at locations like bridges and city gates where it would be impractical to avoid the tolling location. So this brings us to the road construction process itself. As dirt and gravel roads are not particularly interesting, we're going to focus this video on paved roads. So how did they make these incredibly durable and generally straight roads? After all, even with modern machinery, constructing and maintaining an expansive road system is an extremely time-consuming and labor-intensive process. To start with, a group of surveyors would be sent out to figure out the precise direction connecting the two main points. At the same time, they'd attempt to plan the route as efficiently as possible while accounting for any major obstacles like tall mountains, rivers, etc. When possible, they may attempt to avoid such obstacles, but particularly in some of the earliest Roman road constructions where it might result in having to take a large detour to get around, for example, a mountain, if possible given the terrain, they tended just to build the road to go directly over the mountain or directly through it. For example, the longest tunnel through such a mountain was the Grotta di Cocceo, which was excavated from 38 to 36 BCE and is approximately 1 kilometer, that's 0.62 miles long, and about 5 meters, 5.4 yards high and wide. Before World War II, it was also still a fully functional and safe to traverse tunnel, despite standing for about 2,000 years at that point, but unfortunately it was damaged during the war, though there are presently efforts going on to have it repaired and reopened to the public. As for going over a mountain, it's important to note here that we don't mean they'd use switchbacks as is the general method today. No, if at all possible, they'd just build roads straight up over a mountain and down the other side, expecting that soldiers and mules and the like would just man up and traverse the steep slopes without complaint. That said, as the empire matured, it did eventually become apparent that there were economic advantages to slightly longer roads that were easier for draft animals to pull carts over, and thus there was a shift to favoring longer distances but lesser gradients when talking roads for general public use. Either way, during the process, the surveyors would set up markers, often at very visible points like on hills, mapping out the optimal path, again trying to ensure that the road would be as straight as possible between the start and the end point to reduce needed labor, materials, and distance needed to traverse the road once it was complete. So this all brings us to how they actually ensured perfectly straight roads between the markers. A key tool here was a device known as a groma. In a nutshell, this was nothing more than a sort of cross with 4 weights hanging from a string at each end of the cross to function as plumb lines. The whole thing could rotate with degree markers on top. 2 of the plumb lines would then be lined up with a marker and then on the other side lined up with the previous marker. Where changes in direction would need to be made, the degrees were marked and ultimately the whole thing drawn up on a central document showing the entire route of the road with each segment. Once the actual construction was to begin, the groma would once again be used, this time with rods pounded into the ground between markers, using the groma to make sure that every single rod was perfectly in line between the markers. Now, finally, construction of the road would start, usually first done via plows to loosen the soil. This would be followed by legionnaires and/or slaves digging the ground out, with depth varying based on conditions. For instance, swampy lands would need a lot thicker foundation if it was to have any staying power. For more typical ground, the trench needed to be somewhere in the realm of 3 to 6 feet, that's around 1 to 2 meters deep. Once dug out, this would then be tamped down to a leveled, compact layer of earth. From here, the exact road composition varied based on available materials in a given region, as well as land composition and a bunch of other factors like this. But typically, large stones would be packed as tightly as possible together and into the earth base. Onto this layer would usually be placed smaller stones, sometimes comprising broken concrete or somewhat crushed rock. Again, it would be packed and smoothed as best as possible. Depending on availability, they would also put a layer of sand on this foundation to make a genuinely perfectly smooth surface. On top of all of this, at the minimum, gravel would be added, packed, and leveled. In some cases, such as near big cities, as described in one manuscript on the construction of roads in Rome itself, paving stones, often flint, lava rock, or marble, would be embedded in cement for the top layer instead. When the road was complete, they are thought to have been quite smooth, allowing for relatively bump-free travel in carts and things like that. During this whole process, special attention was taken to making the center of the road higher than the sides so that any water would drain off, with the entire road surface itself also elevated above the ground, so on the sides drainage ditches could be put, and these would generally help move water away in times of heavy rains. As for the size of the roads, according to something known as the Law of 12 Tables, which more or less formed the basis of Roman law for almost a millennia, Roman roads were required to be at minimum 8 Roman feet wide, about 2.5 meters, where the road was straight, and double that if the road happened to be curved. Beside the roads were footpaths, sometimes gravelled, which were particularly handy in the case of private roads, where only people with proper authorization could use the road itself. Finally, at the very outer edges of the roads, any nearby trees and bushes would be removed to help reduce areas for bandits to hide and surprise anyone with an attack. It also helped to ensure that plant growth didn't overtake the road or tree roots compromise it. But this still wasn't the end of the construction process. They now needed to know exact distances along the road. It's not fully clear how they did this, though a device known as the odometer of Vitruvius is mentioned starting around 27 BC and is often claimed to have been used for this purpose. However, whether it was actually ever used for road construction or even made at all is still up for debate. At a high level, this device used the spinning of a wheel to mark distance. In this case, it was the spinning of a wagon wheel, which was in turn hooked up to gears that would drop a pebble into a container every Roman mile. That's 4,841 feet, which is around 1,000 paces for an adult male. Indeed, the word mile derives from the Latin milia, meaning, funnily enough, 1,000 paces. For whatever it's worth, while Leonardo da Vinci tried and failed to make such a device as per outlined, in 1981, one André Sleeswyck was successful in building one exactly as described, except unlike da Vinci, he used triangular gear teeth instead of square ones. His justification for this modification being that these same type of gear teeth were used in the Antikythera mechanism, which was created sometime from around 250 to 70 BC, with the device itself used to predict various astronomical phenomena like eclipses. Thus, perhaps if the odometer of Vitruvius was ever actually built and used, maybe it had these too. There are, of course, many other much less technologically advanced ways they could have measured mile distances easily enough with extreme accuracy. However they did it, at every mile mark, the law required them to place an approximately 2-ton, 7-foot tall, with 2 feet in the ground, mile marker called a milarium. Helpfully, on this stone would be engraved the names of the locations the road connected to and how many miles to each one from that respective marker it was. A master marker known as the Millario Aureae, or Golden Milestone, was also created during Caesar Augustus's rule and placed in the central forum of Rome itself. This was the one point at which all Roman roads were said to lead. It's not actually clear what was on this master marker, but it's been speculated that it listed the distances from that point to all major cities under Roman rule. Whatever the case, like the roads themselves, some of these mile markers are still standing today, giving archaeologists and historians a valuable snapshot of the past, since they tended to include not just basic geographic information, but information about when the road was built or repaired and by whom. Next up, it was also required by law that regular way stations be built for official use, generally every 16 to 19 miles apart. These were more or less really nice resting areas, providing food and drink and the like for the officials. For the general public, inns would tend to pop up near these way stations. On that note, at particularly high-trafficked way stations, many other businesses would pop up as well, sometimes leading to the creation of whole towns. Along these roads, you'd also find, at similar intervals, changing stations where people could get the services of veterinarians, wheelwrights, etc., as well as potentially find new mounts. To give you an idea of how fast one could move along these roads with its network of way stations and facilities, it's noted that Emperor Tiberius once traversed about 200 miles in 24 hours after news that his brother was dying from gangrene after being seriously injured falling from a horse. A more typical time to traverse for, say, a government mail carrier was usually about 50 miles per day, if not in a particular hurry. But to sum it up, it turns out that Roman road construction, amenities and all, wasn't all that different from modern times, often featuring deep foundations, paved surfaces, proper drainage, landscaping around the roads, sidewalks, toll booths, rest areas, hotels, restaurants, the historic equivalent of gas stations and convenience stores, etc. In short, the ancient Romans, they were pretty brilliant in a lot of ways. And let's get into those bonus facts. The infamous phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, has come to mean a person who is neglecting their duties, probably by doing something frivolous. But did Nero actually sit around and play music while Rome was burning around him in 64 AD? To begin, there was such a fire, though its extent is unknown. According to Tacitus, the fire lasted for 6 days and decimated Rome, with only 4 districts untouched out of 14. He goes on to state that 10 of the 11 districts that burned were heavily damaged, with 3 of those completely destroyed. However, oddly, there is very little documented mention of the fire from those who actually lived through it. The only Roman historian during that period who even mentioned it was Pliny the Elder, and even he only mentioned it briefly in passing. Had it been as widespread as Tacitus claimed, one would think that the likes of Plutarch, Epictetus, or other famed Roman historians who lived through the fire would have mentioned it as a significant event. And indeed, we see that perhaps it wasn't that great of a fire from the only other documented first-hand account of the scope of the disaster, a letter from Seneca the Younger to Paul the Apostle, where he explicitly stated that only 4 blocks of insulae were burned. These were a type of apartment building, along with 132 private houses being damaged, which was about 7% of the private houses in the city. In terms of the insulae, this was only about 0.009% of them. So basically, it was not anywhere close to as widespread as Tacitus later claimed, though Seneca did say the fire lasted 6 days, as Tacitus stated. As to Nero's reaction to the fire, the first and biggest flaw in the fiddling story is that the fiddle, or violin, didn't actually exist in Nero's time. Historians aren't able to give an exact date for the invention of the violin, but the viol class of instrument, to which the violin belongs, wasn't developed until at least the 11th century. If Nero did actually play a stringed instrument, and there's no evidence that he did, whether during the burning of Rome or otherwise, it was probably a lyre or a cithara. Okay, so some details can get muddled through history, but did Nero neglect Rome while it burned? Historians argue that probably not. Reports do place Nero 35 miles away from Rome at the time of the fire, as he was staying in his villa at Antium. However, an account from Tacitus tells us that he returned to Rome immediately when word of the fire reached him in order to begin relief efforts. As the fire raged on, Nero even opened up his own gardens to provide a temporary home for those who were now homeless. He also ordered the construction of emergency accommodation and cut the price of corn, as well as provided food directly so that people could eat. Besides that, he paid for much of these relief efforts out of his own pocket. However, Tacitus also tells us of the rumor that had spread among the masses. While the flames surged through the city, Nero stood on his private stage and sang about the destruction of Troy in a comparison of the two events. Whether or not the rumor had any evidence to back it up or was just something made up by the unhappy masses, we don't know, but this and Suetonius' account are the most likely source of the fiddle story that we hear today. Unfortunately for Nero, at least in the context of the story, he did have a reputation for enjoying concerts and participating in music competitions, so the activity itself wasn't entirely unlikely, even if the timing of the act is highly questionable. While Tacitus claims the singing story was a rumor, Suetonius wrote about it with conviction. However, the story could have been an attempt to further mar Nero's name. Nero faced problems during his reign from the very start when it was reported that his own mother poisoned his predecessor Claudius. He was also blamed for the death of Claudius's son Britannicus, who was being urged to take his proper place as emperor by overthrowing Nero. Numerous other deaths were thought to have been committed by Nero's hand, including one of his wives, and indeed his own mother. As such, Nero was painted as a man who was difficult for the masses to trust. No one knew how the fire started, and many Romans believed that he had actually started the fire that burned the city. It actually likely started in shops containing flammable goods and was probably an accident rather than one person's intentional act. With the mob out for blood, Nero was forced to turn to a scapegoat and blame Christians for starting the fire. There were only a small number of Christians in Rome at the time, and they were considered a strange religious sect, so they were an easy target. As Tacitus stated, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all Christians who pleaded guilty to the fire. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Even finding someone to blame for the fire, it didn't help Nero's plea of innocence. In the wake of the fire, he built a palace on top of some of the land cleared by the flames, which people argued he had been planning from the start, though this is highly unlikely as the place he built the new palace was over half a mile away from where the fire started. In addition to a new palace, Nero did provide for the reconstruction of the city, but rebuilding stretched the limits of Rome's treasury at the time. He was forced to devalue Roman currency, which was not a popular move. Nero ended up committing suicide, or at least begging his secretary to kill him when he lost the nerve to do it himself 4 years after the fire. Accounts of his life and of the time of the fire are highly contradictory. Further, Suetonius and Tacitus wrote their histories 50 years after Nero died, and Cassius Dio wrote his 150 years later. Many historians also think it likely that Nero was more popular with the people of Rome than he was with the senators, and as all three of the main sources were from the senatorial class, it's likely they carry more than a little bias against him, not unlike what happened with the popular history of Marie Antoinette, who popular culture remembers very differently than who the actual woman appeared to be. That being said, Tacitus did state that while Nero's death was welcomed by senators, the lower classes mourned his passing. So in the end, the implication that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, or played the lyre, sang a song, or neglected his duty in any way is likely the result of anti-Nero propaganda and an attempt to tarnish his name. The morality of many of his actions during his reign is open to debate, but the fiddling or playing music story is almost certainly a myth, unless he was playing to entertain the displaced masses that he'd taken in.
Despite all the veneration we often throw ancient Rome's way, the truth is the ancient Romans built their empire on the backs of slaves, with an estimated 35% of the total population of that society in the 1st century BCE comprised of slaves. So how did slavery start in this civilization, and what was it actually like to be a slave in ancient Rome? As a former question, it may or may not come as a surprise to you, but slavery in this region had been around as long as we have documented evidence of anything that happened there. Thus, by the time Rome became a thing, it was already firmly established as a societal norm. For example, the 5th century BCE legal code, the 12 Tables, had laws relating to slaves and freed slaves. What was a little bit different in these earliest references, such as in the 12 Tables, is that there was a taboo against slaves taking part in religious rituals such as anointing corpses. This is odd, considering that in later years, slaves commonly helped high-ranking priests with rituals important to the running of the state concerning augury and the Sibylline books. What was not odd and seemingly pretty much par for the course in slavery the world over is that in the 12 Tables, slaves often faced a harsher punishment for crimes than free people. For example, if a free person was caught stealing, part of his corporal punishment was flogging, while a slave, well, let's just say they would swiftly, after being caught, cease to continue breathing. As for where the Romans got their slaves, these most commonly came from any people's peoples the Romans were at war with. Unsurprisingly, from this, slave numbers ramped up significantly once Rome began their conquering ways. As Rome expanded its empire into Italy and then out beyond the Mediterranean, captured peoples became slaves and were brought to Rome and other provincial cities. Sometimes these prisoners were sold to dealers during the campaign or taken by the soldiers themselves for use in their respective households. As an average Roman who wanted to buy slaves, it went to specific slave dealers depending on your needs. As to this, slave dealers sold slaves in different markets depending on what type of slave you wanted, with hardier ones sold in one area of the city while domestic individuals were sold in others. All this said, the sale of war prisoners was not the only source of slaves in Rome. There was also a robust slave trade between the Romans and other cultures. This was commonly used to bring in slaves while bypassing certain restrictions. For example, it was illegal in the later empire to castrate slaves. One way around this was to import already castrated slaves from eastern reaches such as Persia and Armenia. Piracy was also another source of slave stock, as pirates commonly kidnapped and sold people, Roman or otherwise, into slavery. It is even known that pirates operated slave plantations on the Italian peninsula where freeborn kidnapped slaves were held before being sold into slavery. People could also be born slaves, regardless of their father's status. If a slave woman were to bear a child, even by her master, that child by default became her master's slave. As such, pairing and breeding was encouraged by masters as a natural means to supply their estate with more slaves. It was also known for Romans themselves to enter slavery, either within Rome, often after a civil war or the like, or as captives in the hands of an enemy. Abandoned children were also at risk of becoming slaves in the Roman Empire. As for the legality of it all, legally slavery was related to death in Roman codes. As far as the law was concerned, you existed in a state like death, and your owner owned you in body and soul with almost no restrictions, save something like the aforementioned eventual ban on castration. You otherwise had no rights. You could own no property, you could not legally start a family, and again, any child you had belonged to your master. Slaves did sometimes have a limited pool of money to spend from called a peculum, but even though they may have accumulated those funds or possessions themselves in some way, that still technically belonged to their masters. Slaves with high status could even have underslaves who waited on and worked for them and were otherwise at their bidding, but the underslaves were still in effect owned by their master, not the higher ranking slave. Beyond this, physically abusing a slave in pretty much any way you pleased was very common and was usually the go-to response of an agitated master. Sexual gratification with a slave was also an accepted action for slave-holding men and at times for women, although it was generally frowned upon for a woman to have sexual relations with her slave. In the end, as property, Roman slaves arguably had fewer rights than modern-day pets in many societies, since our pets are protected by some level of law, though of course pets can be castrated, so that's one win for the Roman slaves, we suppose. Yet, despite the ethical ramifications from modern-day lens, Romans saw slavery as a normal and regular facet of life. Even lower-class individuals potentially owned a slave or two. This all brings us to what slaves got up to when they weren't polishing their master's trophy. It turns out, saying concisely what a typical slave's day-to-day life was like in ancient Rome is an effort in futility, as this could be as diverse as the lives of their masters, save sans any rights to do as they pleased except where their master willed. In the general case, slaves simply helped in production and tasks both in rural and urban areas, but with the majority of slaves being in the countryside. As for slaves belonging to lower-class owners, they were often in charge of extremely diverse tasks, from cooking, cleaning, stabling horses, going on deliveries, helping out in their master's business, etc., perhaps all on the same day. Even if one of these lower-class owner slaves had specialized jobs such as weavers, they usually did more general tasks around the house, such as cooking and cleaning. Basically, they did whatever their master needed them to do in a given moment. Slaves in more well-to-do households, however, tended to be much more specialized. For example, children of the elite generally had attendant slaves, the title given to a slave whose job it was to do basically anything needed to care for the child, as well as do anything the child asked of them. They opened doors and windows for them, dressed them, fed them, washed them, walked them to school, and were otherwise addressed by their little charges by such fun terms as boy. Beyond this, slaves of the elite could be dedicated maidservants, smiths, masons for repairing structures, ploughmen, shepherds, oil press workers, bakers, barbers, bailiffs, and much more depending on the size and wealth of the estate. There were also occupations that required more advanced training and learning, such as treasurers, clerks, secretaries, and doctors. There were even artisanal slaves who worked as gold and silversmiths and pearl setters. The given slave might also be trained as a comic actor, pet child, and even a dwarf. No, really, those last three are found in the records. In the end, basically any job a free person could hold, you could also find a slave trained and doing that profession for their master. Just about the only thing that slaves could not do was serve in the military. There was even job mobility, if you could call it that. Some slave jobs were meant to be grown out of, such as hen keeping and gathering fodder, although older slaves could be assigned those roles later in life. You could also progress from one job to another, such as going from litter bearer to cook. Some slaves were lucky and were allowed to pursue intellectual tasks, such as Timagenes of Alexandria, who eventually became a historian. It should also be noted that there were hierarchies of slaves, so not all slaves or their jobs were equal. As mentioned before, underslaves existed and served higher-ranking slaves, although all involved belonged to one master. On this note, in general, urban slaves had a higher ranking than rural ones. The standing of one's owner also counted in several ways. Slaves belonging to a wealthier or more powerful owner were socially higher than those who belonged to poorer owners. Slaves with high levels of responsibilities were also typically given more luxurious or spacious accommodations compared to lower-ranking ones. Further, as alluded to, slaves could sometimes hold jobs that required great learning, and it is possible, although not thoroughly documented, that there is a career progression in those jobs. There were many such learned professions, such as record keepers, tax stewards, and assistants to the priests. This all meant that there was no single class of slaves. There were several. As you might imagine from this, slave rebellions didn't tend to include all levels of slaves, as these different levels of slaves often competed and didn't see themselves as one class of people. Further, some classes were more comfortable in their station than others. Combined with the fact that slave rebellions tended to be put down brutally, they weren't common. For example, the events of a film you may have watched, Spartacus, started in 73 BCE, and it was the last major slave revolt for the rest of Rome's existence. However, there were other ways to resist oppression, and a large-scale slave rebellion was just one form. Running away from your life as a slave was an occasional thing, despite being punishable by death. However, some slaves lived such a poor quality of life that the possibility of death was preferable to continued mistreatment. Murder and conspiracy to murder were not out of the question, and cases were recorded of slaves going postal and killing their masters and their master's family. Well, more imaginative approaches to resistance. In one case we know of, a slave took revenge on his mistress after she flogged his wife, via said slave then reporting his mistress's cheating affair to his master. Much like in your soul-crushing job, passive resistance was also a common thing, via slaves working as poorly as possible so as to just barely stay within acceptable means. This could mean doing your job slowly or incompetently, lying, and even sabotage, whatever negatively impacted the owner but didn't result in much pain or consequence for yourself. As to mistreatment, coercion was a large part of slave life. All were coerced to work for their masters, but some, like bailiffs and overseers, had the specific role of enforcing that coercion on fellow slaves in place of their masters. Failure to perform could mean demotion, at best physical or emotional harm, such as beatings or separation from your family, and in the end, death at worst. On the flip side, there was a degree of independence depending on your job and position. Urban slaves could even end up working as managers in their owners' businesses. They could run a bank or shop for their owners. The slave agent was even authorized to buy anything the owner required for their business, such as cattle, tools, equipment, real estate, or other slaves. They could run inns, shops, and carry out money-lending operations. This sort of agent was very common, and while it wasn't necessarily just slaves that could be agents, it was common for slaves to be tasked with such. Freed slaves would even sometimes continue this agent work for their former masters after they were freed. On this note of freed slaves, well, what happened after slavery? Well, usually death was the only release for the vast majority of slaves, but for some, manumission was possible, with slaves and their former masters then often having a client-patron relationship. In fact, inheritance laws made it so that former masters inherited their freed man's possessions if the former slave died without heirs. Going back to life though, depending on the high status of your patron, you could get a boost in prestige and standing as a freed person from their household. Thus, a freed slave of a poor household held a lot less prestige than a freed slave of, say, the emperor. Depending on your patron, you could leverage that prestige to marry wealthy freed or free women and cement generational wealth for your freeborn children. Manumission did not always mean freedom from your old job, however. After all, you were trained in that job, and you may have done it all your life. Thus, as alluded to, many ex-slaves returned to their old job simply now as free people, whether that was as secretaries or as domestic servants. The difference being, of course, that they could now accumulate their own wealth from their efforts, in some cases quite substantial wealth if their trained trade was a lucrative one. These ultimately wealthy freed individuals sometimes had the airs of the nouveau riche, attempting to live like their masters, including with their own retinue of slaves. It was also possible for slaves to attain Roman citizenship and even have descendants that achieved equestrian status. This social mobility away from slavery goes to highlight how diverse the slave experience was in Rome. That said, as slaves made up upwards of 1 in 3 people comprising Rome's population at any given time, there were rules about freeing one's slaves. A rush of freed slaves, especially from larger estates, which could have many hundreds of slaves, could pose a risk to public order after all. As such, laws restricted how many slaves an owner could free upon his death, depending on how big his retinue was. But as for some of these freedmen, one of the elite, remembered among them today, is the aforementioned Timagenes of Alexandria, a historian and jurist. Originally a slave who was a cook, he was allowed to advance to a position where he could learn to read and write, ultimately becoming a noted historian. Unfortunately, his works did not survive, primarily as he got on the wrong side of Augustus during his campaigns in Egypt, as Timagenes was thought to have helped Antony and Cleopatra in the spat. In the end, he is thought to have been poisoned by Augustus in his home in modern-day Albania. A much more famous former slave was the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, born in 50 CE. Epictetus was a slave to Emperor Nero's secretary, Epaphroditus, himself also a freedman. While still a slave, Epictetus was allowed to study Stoic philosophy with Musonius Rufus, a prominent Stoic. We actually don't have proof of Epictetus's manumission, so for all we know, he might have died a slave. Nevertheless, he rose to prominence, teaching things like some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. The things that are up to us are by nature free, unhindered, and unimpeded. The things that are not up to us are weak, enslaved, hindered, not our own. If you think that only what is yours, and that what is not your own is not your own, then no one will ever coerce you, and no one will harm you, because you will not be harmed at all. It is easy to see this as the philosophy of a former slave, but this is in line with Stoic thought before Epictetus. Epictetus knew hardship under slavery. For example, it's thought that he had some sort of physical disability from Epaphroditus. Fascinatingly, given that he himself was a former slave, purposefully breaking Epictetus's leg, among apparently many other brutal beatings. Naturally, freedom was a theme in Epictetus's work, but if you are expecting our modern sense of individual political or economic freedom, well, you'd be mistaken. Epictetus taught of spiritual freedom, the kind anyone can attain regardless of their condition. He is an important figure in the survival of Stoic philosophy because his works are some of the only complete texts to come down to us from this era. In the end, the life of an individual slave in ancient Rome could vary almost as much as the life of any free individual, with the exception of that the slave's life was not their own in any way their master did not will. Thus, the world of a slave in Rome, as is the world of a slave in any society, was more often than not a sad state of affairs. Considered quasi-dead by the law and with practically no protections, slaves were at the mercy of their masters. In the heart of Rome stands one of the Eternal City's most famous and well-preserved ancient monuments, the Pantheon. Constructed during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, the building has been in near continuous use for 2 millennia, first as a temple dedicated to the Olympian gods and then as a Catholic basilica. Home to exquisitely preserved Roman architecture and the tombs of such luminaries as the artist Raphael and King Vittorio Emanuele II, the Pantheon has inspired the design of buildings around the world and remains one of Rome's most popular tourist attractions, visited by some 6 million people every year. But perhaps its most celebrated feature is its 43-meter coffered dome, crowned by a 9-meter circular oculus or opening that floods the rotunda below with light. Incredibly, this impressive structure is not built, as one might expect, of marble or brick, but rather of concrete. Even more impressively, it contains not one piece of rebar or other structural reinforcement, making it the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. This fact may shock and confuse those of us living in the modern world, where one bad winter is often enough to turn concrete roads and bridges into something resembling the surface of the moon. So, what allowed Roman concrete to last millennia, while modern concrete crumbles after just a few years? Well, Roman concrete is known to have reached widespread use around 150 BC, though most archaeologists believe it was first developed nearly a century earlier. Like its modern counterpart, Roman concrete has 2 basic components: cement, a powder that sets hard when mixed with water, and aggregate, a mixture of gravel and other small hard particles that add strength to the mixture. Modern cement, known as ordinary Portland cement or OPC, is made by heating limestone as well as various other ingredients including clay, iron ore, sand, gypsum and coal ash in a kiln to produce a lumpy mixture called clinker. The clinker is then ground down to produce cement powder. The composition of Roman concrete was broadly similar, consisting largely of calcium oxide or quicklime made by heating limestone in a kiln. This was then mixed with pulvis or pozzolana, a fine glassy volcanic ash found mainly around the Bay of Naples. Pozzolana was considered the secret source of Roman concrete, so much so that hundreds of thousands of tons were shipped across the Roman Empire as far as Alexandria, Egypt, for use in construction projects. There were, however, some significant differences between Roman and modern concrete. For example, while modern concrete uses aggregate mainly composed of sand and pea-sized gravel, Roman aggregate, or caementa, consisted of larger, fist-sized chunks of volcanic stone called tephra and pieces of brick and other recycled building materials. Like modern concrete, Roman concrete hardened not by drying, but via the hydration and crystallization of the calcium aluminium silicate compounds, also known as stratolingite, formed from the reaction of quicklime and pozzolana and could thus set in the absence of oxygen, even underwater. This allowed the Romans to build concrete harbour piers, breakwaters, and other underwater structures without the need to build dry cofferdams. The earliest example of such hydraulic cement being used is in the construction of the harbour at Baiae near Naples in the late 2nd century BCE, while its larger scale application was the harbour of Caesarea Maritima in modern-day Israel, whose concrete piers are still intact to this very day, despite being exposed to the Mediterranean Sea for 2 millennia. This remarkable longevity baffled architects and material scientists for decades, for while the long-term survival of surface structures like aqueducts is impressive enough, immersion in seawater is ordinarily lethal to concrete, causing it to crumble within decades. Yet not only have the piers at Caesarea Maritima survived, they've actually gotten stronger over time. Even more bafflingly, in terms of sheer compressive strength, Roman concrete is actually 10 times weaker than modern OPC-based concrete, yet somehow many times more resilient. So, what's going on here? To uncover the secrets of Roman concrete's remarkable resilience, in 2013, a team of researchers led by Paolo Montiero, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, analyzed samples of concrete from the piers at Caesarea Maritima. To their surprise, they discovered crystals of a rare calcium silicate hydrate material called tobermorite. These crystals, they deduced, were formed via the reaction of the material philipsite in the pozzolana ash with seawater that had percolated into the concrete. Not only is tobermorite harder than any of the concrete's original constituents, but its formation traps molecules like chlorides and sulfates that ordinarily damage concrete, meaning, amazingly, that immersion in seawater actually makes Roman concrete grow stronger and more durable with time. As well as potentially improving the performance of modern concrete, this discovery may have wider applications in industry, as aluminious taborite normally requires high temperatures and large amounts of energy to synthesize. Another key to Roman concrete's durability lies in one of its most historically baffling features, the presence of brittle white inclusions called lime clasts throughout its structure. For decades, archaeologists attributed these inclusions to poor quality raw materials or sloppy mixing practices. However, some experts like Admir Masick, a professor of civil environmental engineering at MIT, were skeptical of this explanation. He states, "The idea that the presence of these lime clasts was simply attributed to low quality control always bothered me. If the Romans put so much effort into making an outstanding construction material following all of the detailed recipes that have been optimized over the course of many centuries, why would they put so little effort into ensuring the production of a well-mixed final product? There has to be more to this story." Indeed, in his 10 books on architecture, written in 25 BCE, the great Roman architect Vitruvius laid out extremely precise recipes for concrete, while Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, spearheaded major construction and restoration projects in Rome that resulted in the widespread systemization and standardization of concrete manufacture. In 2022, the team, led by Masick, conducted spectroscopic analyses of concrete samples from the mausoleum of Roman noblewoman Caecilia Matea, built between 20 and 10 BCE. These analyses revealed that the lime clasts are composed of various types of calcium carbonate and oxide, which are much more brittle than the surrounding cement matrix. Whenever the concrete shifts, either due to the ground settling or the earthquakes that commonly plague the region, this brittleness causes cracks to form preferentially within the the clasts. However, rain or groundwater percolating through the concrete reacts with the clasts, promoting the growth of calcium carbonate crystals that eventually fill and reinforce the cracks. This reaction effectively makes the concrete self-healing, filling small cracks before they could grow into larger and more dangerous fractures. Now, to test this theory, Massick cast and cracked 2 samples of modern and Roman concrete and ran a stream of water through them. As predicted, within 2 weeks, the cracks in the Roman concrete had sealed themselves, preventing the water from flowing through. Massick's analysis also revealed that the lime clasts could only have formed at high temperatures, indicating that the Romans mixed their concrete very differently than modern builders. Today, quicklime is mixed with water, producing calcium hydroxide or slaked lime before being added to the concrete mixture. The Romans, however, added quicklime directly to the mixture, a technique known as hot mixing. Not only does hot mixing produce the high temperatures needed to form the self-healing lime clasts, but it also reduces overall curing time, allowing for faster construction. But clever chemistry isn't the whole story here, and the final key to the remarkable longevity of Roman concrete lies in the specific manner that it was cast. According to Vitruvius, unlike modern concrete, which is mixed wet and poured, Roman concrete was mixed dry with as little water as possible, with the resulting putty-like mixture being troweled into place. Large pieces of aggregate, like volcanic tephra and brick or building stone fragments, were then laid atop the concrete before another layer of concrete was troweled on top. The whole layer was then tamped down using special tools. By tightly compacting the mixture and reducing its water content, Roman builders minimized the formation of voids within the structure, the main source of weakness in concrete, and promoted the formation of tough stradlingite crystals. Interestingly, the advantages of this construction method were confirmed by a much more recent construction project, and that's the building of the Upper Stillwater Dam in eastern Utah in 1987. The concrete used in the dam's construction was composed of 40% OPC and 60% coal ash, closely replicating the lime pozzolana chemistry of Roman concrete. This mixture was mixed with minimal water to form no-slump concrete, which was spread in layers and compacted into place using giant vibrating rollers. Later analysis of the dam structure has revealed many of the same self-healing properties exhibited by Roman concrete. These various chemical mixing and layup tricks combined to create what Philip Brun, a research scientist at DuPont Chemical, calls, quote, an extraordinarily rich material in terms of scientific possibility, the most durable building material in human history, and I say that as an engineer not prone to hyperbole, end quote. Indeed, scientists and engineers around the world are actively studying the secrets of this extraordinary ancient building material in order to improve the efficiency and durability of modern concrete, an urgent task given our current climate crisis. While concrete is an extraordinarily versatile material with 19 billion tons being used every year worldwide, it has an equally outsized impact on the environment, being responsible for up to 8% of global CO2 emissions. Most of these emissions come from the production of clinker, which requires temperatures of 1,450 degrees Celsius and consumes large amounts of fossil fuels. The use of motor vehicles to transport, pour, and repair concrete also contributes to this carbon footprint, a problem made all the worse by the low durability of modern concrete. Roman concrete, by contrast, is made from ingredients fired at much lower temperatures, thus requiring less fuel, and lasts much longer, greatly reducing the frequency with which it must be replaced. And while Roman concrete's secret ingredient, pozzolana ash, is relatively rare, studies have shown it can be replaced with readily available coal ash with little reduction in performance. Indeed, Roman-style concrete made with fly ash could cost up to 60% less to produce than regular OPC-based concrete, providing a powerful incentive for builders to switch over. Thus, with any luck, this wonder material from 2 millennia ago may very well help ensure that our current civilization will last another 2 millennia. But then again, well, what have the Romans ever done for us? When we talk about the sexuality of the Greeks and Romans, thanks to Hollywood, probably pops instantly to your mind are things like decadent orgies, as depicted in such classic films as the 1979 erotic historical drama Caligula, starring such Hollywood elite as Academy Award winner Dame Helen Mirren, 8-time Academy Award nominee Peter O'Toole, and Hollywood mainstay Malcolm McDowell, also noted British person. But was this actually how it was? Well, drop your togas and whip out your copy of Sappho's poetry, and let's discuss ancient Roman and Greek sex life, shall we? To begin with, it's important to understand how important class and status was in the sex practices of our ancient brethren. We'll do a deep dive into what this had to do with sex shortly, but to start, while the Greeks and Romans were very different cultures, they shared some similarities. One such similarity was the dominance of the upper classes. Those classes had a duty both to rule and defend Rome, or whatever Greek city-state they belonged to. It was the men who fought and the men who ruled. Men were voted in democratic elections in Greece, and men served in the Roman Senate. These men belonged to great families that cared very much about keeping their lineage pure and untarnished by the lower classes. Women were the target of this anxiety, and their sexuality, and particularly with regards to getting pregnant, was seen as a threat to the elite bloodlines. As such, women were forced to abide by a system that saw them as lesser than the men in their lives. This is a long way of saying men in both societies had much greater sexual freedoms than women, but that's not to say the men were wild by any standards. You see, Greeks and Romans were religious people that had rules and taboos in their religion to regulate sexual mores. Just like in Christianity, adultery was a great transgression. However, in Greek and Roman religion, adultery meant something different than what it means to us. For men, adultery was sleeping with another man's wife. Chastity for a Roman man did not mean the full abstainment from sex, but rather moderation when sleeping with socially approved partners such as your wife, prostitutes, slaves, servants, mistresses, concubines, and even young boys, and more on that later. However, even with the vast sexual freedom males enjoyed, in theory they were expected to show a level of moderation, as this was considered an elite virtue that proved you were worthy of your station and responsibilities in society. If you could control your desires and not give in to them as much, you can control the people under you and handle your difficult duties well. So, what about the women? Here we have a very different picture. Adultery for women was sleeping with any man not their husband. Women were heavily controlled. Both societies were gender segregated, but Greece much more so than Rome. While of course different city-states had differences, in the general case Greek women were isolated from other men as much as possible. They were not even typically allowed to eat at a table if another man other than their husband was eating at it. The Greeks also had officials whose job it was to control and police women. This included everything from policing women's dress and conduct in public and private settings to also supervising female religious rituals and female behavior in ceremonies. On the other hand, Roman women had more of a public presence, lived less gender-segregated lives, and could socialize with men outside of their family and marriage. However, this didn't mean they were as liberated as the men. If an elite woman was too involved in society, her husband was often accused of weakness, and the weakness of one elite man threatened the delicate class order. As such, women were still controlled in Roman society, and even though the level of control was less than in Greek society, it still had its own flavor of malice. If you know anything about Rome's mythological foundations, there is a lot of sexual assault involved. The first real presence of women in the foundation myth is the kidnapping and forced habitation of the Sabine women. Later, the Etruscan prince sexually assaults the noble Lucretia. With that unfortunate history comes honor killings. Elite Roman women like Lucretia set a standard that a woman's degradation was degradation of her family. As such, Lucretia committed suicide to protect her and her family's reputation, setting the standard that the violation of an elite woman should be met with death. Honor killings became a feature of Rome's understanding of women in class. Even an elite woman receiving an unwanted kiss from a lower class man was enough to prompt that man's death. It is also important to keep in mind that even when Greece fell under the Roman Empire, they still maintained very different cultures. The Romans thought the Greeks were backwards and prudish, while the Greeks thought the Romans were too wild and free with their women. It is also important to remember that others existed in the Roman Empire and the Hellenic world. Etruscans, who used to be an early rival of the Romans, were seen to have much freer sexual relations, and we could, without a doubt, label them as wild, even by modern standards. Greeks were appalled that Etruscan women could eat freely in front of men and walk around naked. More to the topic at hand, men and women could have sex any place, in any act, any time, with anyone. That said, going back to the Greeks, as alluded to, there was a lot of variation. The Spartans, for example, led a very different society that normalized sexual relations between men and boys, and even for a time, women and girls. This brings us to the other big stereotype about the classical world, the Greek fondness for boys, or pedestry. That the Greeks practiced pedestry is not a myth. This was a practice among elite Greek men and boys to set up mentorships and prepare the next generation for their duties. The Hellenic ideal of moderation played a big role here. Sexual acts between these pairs were expected to happen, but a chaste, loving relationship was also encouraged. Thus, ideally, these relationships remained chaste if sexually charged. Mentors liked to leer at their charges while they trained in some duties naked, especially wrestling, a beloved pastime of elite Greek men. This brings us back to the alluded to huge difference between us today and the Hellenic world. They perceived sexual acts not so much defined by male and female, but passive and dominant. And key here was that elite men must always be dominant and never passive, and your station in life played a big part in what role you could play in the bedroom.
For example, in their view, anal penetration was as passive as a man can get, and thus an elite male would never acceptably bottom. In fact, in Rome, a good character assassination of an elite man was to charge him with having been passive and receiving penetrative sex from his mentor as a youth. No less large of a historic figure as Julius Caesar was accused of this, and indeed such a huge stigma was attached to this that many a political career was ruined by such charges, and a great way to vilify someone in history as well was to discuss them partaking in such practices. This was a big reason why the practice of pederasty wasn't emulated in Rome as in Greece. A chaste relationship, instead, was supposed to be the ideal, as it built strong emotional connections between the boys and the men, but without the major stigma for the boy once he became a man. That said, although the Romans did not practice pederasty like the Greeks, it doesn't mean that Roman men didn't enjoy such relations. Again, the distinction here had more to do with your status and the dominant and passive paradigm. As such, slave boys were popular sexual partners for elite men, even receiving the nickname of pets with no stigma, as were prostitutes and men of certain vocations like actors. But again, the Romans did not like the Greek practice of pederasty and saw it as proof of the Greeks' backwardness, so they left it out of the training of elite boys. Despite the different cultural attitudes about pederasty, the two did share similarities when it came to passivity, looking down on males that were passive in both societies. As far as women and homosexuality in these cultures go, we know much less. While male homosexuality was usually accepted, again, within the bounds of class and passive and dominant, female homosexuality seems to have been much less so. That said, in different cultures, such as on Lesbos and Sparta, female homosexuality was accepted. Noteworthy here, there is the famous poet Sappho of Lesbos, who lived between 630 and 570 BC. It was her love of poetry and Lesbos' own reputation as being more open culturally to female homosexuality that gave us the term lesbian. In any event, despite this, for most Greeks and Romans, sexual relations between women were seen as unnatural and associated with prostitutes. We do not know why this association was made, but we do see a stereotype of women who have sex with women as being ugly prostitutes. Even Sappho was portrayed in later Roman and Greek literature as such. We also know that elite women were usually not afforded the option of homosexual relationships the way men were, although it definitely happened. In these cases, it was not considered adultery, but it was overall frowned upon. Now, this brings us to prostitution, which we brought up quite a bit for good reason. Indeed, if public acceptance of prostitution is your mileage for how wild a society is, then the Greeks and Romans were extremely wild. There was no shame or stigma in purchasing the services of a prostitute, and the trade was even regulated by the state. It should also be noted that there were many levels to prostitution. High-level prostitutes openly socialized with upper classes and even attended dinner parties. They could also be educated and accrue power, even in the gender-segregated world of the ancient Greeks. This is seen in the writings of Athenaeus. Lower-level prostitutes varied depending on how much they charged and where they had sex with their clients. A common word for lower prostitutes in Latin was lupa or wolf, with a brothel sometimes called a wolf's den. All that said, while a prostitute's status may be high or low and hiring one's services was commonly and perfectly acceptable, the Romans and Greeks generally looked down on prostitutes themselves to some extent. Such hostility can be seen when Juvenal accused Empress Messalina of being a prostitute, a charge that would have come up against future empresses such as Empress Theodora. You might at this point be wondering about the sex acts themselves and whether they could be characterized as particularly wild by our standards. And in short, please. We have the internet and Rule 34, so no, we absolutely dominate there, and the ancient Romans were definitely our collective passives. In fact, sex between a man and any of his approved partners was limited in the kind of acts, at least in terms of what was considered socially acceptable. An elite man was expected to remain dominant, thus acts we consider perfectly normal in our beds could be perceived as passive and inappropriate for an elite man to undergo. The obvious here is anal penetration. It was completely out of the question for an elite to receive. However, what might surprise you is that oral sex, whether fellatio or cunnilingus, was forbidden. In Roman purity ritual law, sexual discharge was considered impure, so rituals of ablution and purification were undergone, especially after sex, to prepare for religious rituals. Oral sex was seen as especially problematic, as the impurity of the discharge could be passed to anyone you kiss. This leaves the options for sexual intercourse rather limited by our standards today. That said, we do know they had sex toys, as depicted in art and
and pottery, and birth control was widely practiced, of which they apparently used many methods that were quite effective, most of which have been lost to history. Of course, most of these sexual mores and practices changed with the advent of Christianity, with much of this having to do with the attitude of Paul of Tarsus. Paul redefined chastity for these societies. Sex in general was discouraged, but in the words of Paul in his letter to Corinthians, it is better to marry than to burn. In the same letter, Paul made the groundbreaking change to limit the sexual partners of men to just their wives. In his letter to the Romans, Paul further prunes what is acceptable sexually, particularly considering any homosexual act as dishonorable and unnatural, and linked it with other grave sins. It should be noted here that somewhat ironically, and perhaps influencing the doctrine against the idea, many pagans saw the early Christians as a wild sex cult. In fact, their secretive gender-mixed rituals were seen as a front for sex rituals, a charge some early Christian martyrs attempted to disprove by castrating themselves. Of course, Paul won at the end of the day, and many of the Greek and Roman sexual practices taken for granted over the millennia rapidly disappeared thanks to this shift in thinking. In the end, while it's likely true that some ancient Romans and Greeks did basically everything it's possible to do to one another sexually behind closed doors, when looking at what the cultures themselves considered acceptable, the Greeks and Romans were both more prudish than our collective modern selves in some ways, and at the same time wilder in terms of certain things that were accepted, some of which in modern times might see them thrown in prison for a good long time. Perhaps the most interesting distinction of all is that sexual norms in the Hellenic world were shaped more by class anxieties and your station in life rather than factors like religion or even, to an extent, gender or age.
There are few hand gestures out there that are as well known or as ubiquitous as the humble thumbs up. But why is this seemingly innocuous gesture so widespread? And how did it come to mean everything is okay in so many cultures? And also, well, where did it come from? The commonly told origin is that it came from the Romans and their gladiatorial games. Thumbs up meant live and thumbs down meant die. This is unequivocally false. While it is true that in the days of gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum, and in the earlier and significantly larger Circus Maximus, the audience could decide the fate of a fallen gladiator with a simple hand gesture, this isn't typically depicted accurately and has little to do with why a thumbs up and thumbs down means what it does today. The fate of a gladiator, in terms of whether the audience was voting for a kill, was decided with what was known as a police verso, a Latin term which roughly translates to turned thumb. More precisely what this means is unknown, and there are no accounts that have survived to this day that describe it in any real detail. As such, we're unable to say for sure which way the thumb was supposed to be pointed if the audience wanted a given gladiator to be killed, or if they could just wave their thumb around at random, which it seems may well have actually been the case. So that's voting for death, but what about life? The gesture to spare a given gladiator's life seems to have been neither a thumbs up nor a thumbs down. Instead, you had to hide your thumb inside your fist, forming a gesture known as a police compresso, or compressed thumb. The reasons for this are speculated to be twofold. One, it made the decision of the crowd easier to discern, since it's easier to tell the difference between a thumb turned into a closed fist than a thumbs up and a thumbs down from a long ways away. Secondly, the gestures themselves are thought to be largely symbolic of what they represented. A pointed thumb represented the audience's desire for the victorious gladiator to deliver his coup de grace, stab the fallen foe, while a hidden thumb symbolized that they wished the gladiator to stay his blade, sheathing it in much the way they'd hidden their thumb. Hence why it's thought turned thumb may well have simply been waving your thumb around in the air, perhaps in a stabbing motion. However, this fact is largely absent from pop culture representations, most notably in the otherwise enjoyable 2000 movie Gladiator, in which Joaquin Phoenix is shown giving a defeated gladiator a thumbs down to signify that he wishes for him to be killed. According to director Ridley Scott, that scene was inspired by a painting from 1872 called Police Verso. The painting depicts a victorious gladiator standing over the lifeless body of his opponent while a baying crowd jeers and delivers a tsunami of downturned thumbs. Scott stated of the painting, "That image spoke to me of the Roman Empire in all its glory and wickedness. I knew right then and there I was hooked." That particular painting has been noted by historians as the catalyst for why the concept of police verso is so poorly understood by the masses today. What makes this fact so surprising is that the painter behind the piece, Jean-Léon Gérôme, was a hugely respected historical artist who was internationally renowned for his archaeologically correct historical paintings. Gérôme has been described as a learned classicist and was famous for extensively researching his pieces before putting brush to canvas. For example, with police verso, Gérôme studied actual pieces of armor from the ruins of Pompeii so that the gladiators in his paintings looked authentic. Gérôme's legendary attention to detail is probably the reason that his interpretation of police verso was so widely accepted by academics and why it was so widely disseminated, even after it was proven false. As for what historians of his era thought, interpretations varied greatly from thumbs up meaning kill and thumbs down meaning live and vice versa, to hidden thumb and fist meaning live and thumbs down meaning kill and pretty much every variation therein. Why Gérôme chose thumbs down isn't known, or even whether he meant it, as is often interpreted, to kill. People predominantly interpreted the painting this way, and still do, but in truth, there is no evidence that this is what Gérôme was going for. So, if the Romans aren't generally thought today to be the origin of the thumbs-up gesture, well, who was? That isn't known precisely, and we're left mostly with just guesses. But it might surprise you that the mass popularity of thumbs up or thumbs down, meaning as it does today, is a fairly recent phenomenon, though gesturing with one's thumb is prevalent in many cultures throughout much of history with a lot of different meanings. So what about some educated guesses then? If you ask linguist anthropologist Joel Scherzer of the University of Texas, the gesture meaning something likely predates the Romans. He went on to say of the Europeans, "The dichotomy of up meaning positive and down meaning negative pervades the language and gesture systems of Europe. The thumbs-up gesture today originates from this contrast." We can see evidence of this gesture in such images as the 1617 painting by the Spanish artist Diego Velázquez titled The Lunch, though what the gesture meant precisely in this case is open to interpretation. As for a speculative theory that is a little more concrete, one of the more convincing hypotheses of the origin of the modern meaning of thumbs up comes from Desmond Morris's 1979 work, Gestures, Their Origin and Distribution. He states that it derives from a custom prevalent in medieval times where people making a deal would lick their thumbs and press them up against one another, rather like shaking hands today. It's thought that over time, this diluted to the act of simply sticking one's non-licked thumb into the air to symbolize approval. Whatever the case, at the least, we do know how the meaning was so widely popularized. For this one, we need to fast forward to much more recently in history, World War II. During World War II, the thumbs-up gesture was used extensively by American pilots as a shorthand way of indicating to their ground crews that they were ready to fly. It's been speculated that they got this from the Chinese, with specifically the Flying Tiger Brigade of American pilots based in China seemingly being the first or among the first to popularly use the gesture, at least as far as photographic evidence from the era seems to indicate. To the Chinese at this time, the thumbs-up gesture meant number one or nice job depending on the context. Why this is the case is up for debate. Whether it truly was adopted from the Chinese or some other source, the American pilot version initially meant I'm ready or good to go. From here, things became more clear. This ready meaning soon evolved into a simple, all-encompassing way to indicate that everything was okay in situations where verbal cues weren't possible or advisable. It was also picked up by the rest of the American military, who proceeded to make extensive use of the gesture during their many campaigns across Europe. In the process, it was picked up by the locals and soldiers from other militaries. From there, the thumbs-up symbol temporarily declined somewhat in popularity in the 1960s, but made a huge comeback thanks to Hollywood, and particularly Fonzie and his two thumbs-up gesture in Happy Days, which debuted in 1974. Today, thanks to the widespread use of thumbs up meaning like or good, and thumbs down meaning the opposite on numerous popular websites and apps, the meaning of this hand gesture is likely not going to go anywhere for the foreseeable future. And now for some bonus facts. As we alluded to previously, there are several places on Earth where a thumbs-up gesture is considered a grave insult. For example, in places like Iraq and Greece, sticking your thumb up is akin to saying, shove it up your ass. It also meant this in Australia before World War II, but afterwards switched to the modern meaning thanks to the dissemination of the gesture throughout the Allied military. The exact reasoning behind this meaning, as with many gestures, isn't clear, but it is believed to be representative of the action that would be required for you to act out the insult itself.
In fact, in some of these cultures that interpret it this way, an up and down movement often accompanies the gesture to make the meaning perfectly clear. On that note, when American troops first started being stationed in Iraq, some reported being greeted by civilians offering a thumbs up, with the soldiers and many in the media interpreting it as most Westerners would, all the while not realizing the obscene connotations that it had in the country. Speaking of telling someone to go F themselves, ever wonder how the middle finger came to mean just that? Well, want to know more. Similar to the thumbs up in certain cultures, extending the middle finger simply represents the phallus, with it perhaps natural enough that our forebears chose their longest finger to symbolically represent man's favorite digit. In fact, humans have been using the middle finger for this going back as long as we've been humaning. For example, in ancient Greece, beyond being a general insult, in some cases there seems to be a specific implication from the insult that the person the gesture was directed at liked to take it up the bum. In the case of men, despite male-on-male loving being widely accepted in the culture at the time, there was still potentially negative connotations with regards to one's manliness when functioning as the bottom in such a rendezvous, particularly the bottom for someone of a lower social standing. As for an early specific example, we have Aristophanes' 423 BC The Clouds. In it, a character known as Strepsiades, tired of Socrates pontificating, decides to flip off the famed philosopher. Here's an excerpt. Socrates. Well, to begin with, they'll make you elegant in company and you'll recognize the different rhythms, the Enoplian and the dactylic, which is like a digit. Strepsiades. Like a digit? By God, that's something I do know. Socrates. Then tell me. Strepsiades. When I was a lad, a digit meant this. At this point, Strepsiades sticks his middle finger straight up under Socrates' nose. Countless other examples exist of the middle finger being used in this way through much of ancient history, though it seems to have fallen out of favor during the Middle Ages with the rise of Christianity, or at least records of it diminish. This may mean people actually stopped flipping the bird, or maybe people just stopped writing about it because it was uncouth. That said, we do know, thanks to the Etymologia of Isidore of Seville, that at least as late as the 6th century, people were still extending the finger as an insult, in this reference particularly directed at someone who had done something considered shameful, leading us to think about the rather hilarious mental image of a middle-aged clergyman walking around flipping off random people. Moving on to more modern times, the gesture was popularly resurrected in documented history starting around the early 19th century, with early photographic evidence later popping up in the latter half of the 1800s. Most famously, we have a photograph of the gesture flashed by present-day Twitter sensation and former 19th century baseball Ironman Charlie Old Hoss Radbourn. Radbourn was a pitcher for the Boston Bean-Eaters in 1886 when the team, along with the New York Giants, posed for a group photo. In the photo, Old Hoss can be seen giving the bird to the cameraman.
The subject of what a political leader in a democracy does after his term has ended and the merits of gracefully resigning from power has been on the news recently. Enter the subject of today's story, which takes place in ancient Rome at the dawn of the Republic era. The person in question was Cincinnatus, whose actions in terms of political ethics not only shaped the political life of generations to come, but was linked with the essence of what democratical thinking is, so much so that founders of the American nation dubbed Washington with Cincinnatus's name. So who was Cincinnatus, and what made him rather unique compared to the vast majority of his political leader compatriots throughout history? Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus was born to the noble house of Quincti, possibly around 519 BC, during the last years of the Kingdom of Rome. This means he belonged to the first generation to be raised within the just recently established grand experiment that was the Roman Republic. In the 460s, Rome was in turmoil, with the main issue being the representation of the plebeians in government, those of its citizens not born to noble families. At one of the violent clashes, one of two serving consuls, Publius Valerius Publicola, was killed. Cincinnatus rose to his position as a replacement via a system vaguely similar to how a vice president can replace the president in the United States. Cincinnatus therefore served a term in the highest political office in Rome. Ultimately, however, rather than trying to cling to power like so many others, he eventually chose to return to his private life. This was at the least unusual for various reasons. For one thing, he did not step down because he was fed up with politics. Far from it, he was highly opinionated regarding the issues of his day, with a strong stance against the plebeian demands for constitutional changes that would allow them to circumscribe the decisions of the consuls. Romans. Furthermore, he was in a very difficult financial situation because of a fine he had to pay on account of his son Caeso, who, after causing political turmoil and violence, left the city before the court had reached a sentence. In the end, Cincinnatus had to pay a rather large fine in his stead, for which he had to sell his estate and instead live on a small farm across the Tiber. Thus, by stepping away, he not only gave up incredible power, but was also returning to the life not so much as a wealthy noble as he had been before his term in office, but rather the life of a simple farmer. While all of this did nothing to advance his personal fortunes, his choice not to use his term as consul as a means to broaden his political career, change his economic fortune, or even to recall his son, whom the Republic had condemned, gained him the respect of fellow Romans. But the story of Cincinnatus was just beginning. 2 years later, around 458 BC, Rome was once again imperiled as the army of the neighboring nation of Aequi broke towards Rome, defeating one consular army while the other was far from the action. To respond to this imminent threat, the Senate decided to elect a dictator, which at that time was a title provided by the Senate to a person who would have king-like powers for a fixed term, 6 months, after which the power would be returned to the Senate. This enabled the appointed dictator to act swiftly without asking for permission or waiting for the conclusion of further and often extended senatorial debates. Naturally, the person chosen for this role had to not only be eminently capable, but also trusted to actually step away when the term was finished. Thus, for this role, the Senate chose Cincinnatus. The historian Livy illustrates the scene. A group of senators approached the farm where Cincinnatus was working. He greeted them and asked if everything was in order. "It might turn out well for both you and your country," they replied, and they asked him to wear his senatorial toga before they spoke further. After he donned the garb of the office, they informed him of the Senate's mandate, hailed him as dictator, and took him with them back to Rome. Cincinnatus then got right to work mobilizing the army, besieging the enemy at the Battle of Mount Algidus, and returning victorious to Rome, all in the span of 2 weeks. After this huge success, all possible political exploits could have been available to him, especially as he was constitutionally allowed to stay in power for 5.5 more months. Despite this, upon his return, he immediately abdicated and returned to his farm. The task at hand was complete, thus he saw no reason power shouldn't be returned to the Senate. Twice, he could have used his position for his own gain, and twice he had not only chosen not to, but stepped away when his work was complete. But this isn't the end of Cincinnatus' tale. 19 years later, in 439 BC, Cincinnatus was around 80 years old and once again asked to become dictator, this time to deal with inner political intrigue, as a certain Malleus was using his money to try and be crowned king, the ultimate threat against any republic. The episode ended with the death of the would-be king, and again, his work done, Cincinnatus resigned after having served less than a month as dictator in this instance. As you might expect from all of this, these practically unprecedented actions by a leader granted infinite power made his name synonymous with civic virtue, humility, and modesty, and they serve as an example of caring about the greater good. To understand the importance of these actions, one needs to zoom out and evaluate the time period in which they happened. At the time, the republic system was a novel occurrence in world history, to outsiders not necessarily different from a weird type of oligarchy. Furthermore, except for some initial reactions from the Etruscans directly after the founding of the republic, the system which dictates that the city leads itself was not really put to the test. It would have been completely understandable if, given the first opportunity, the city had turned back to a typical king-like government. The existence of a charismatic leader like Cincinnatus could easily be the catalyst to usher in the return to the era of kings if the incredibly popular Cincinnatus was inclined to take the power. Yet he chose not to, even after being granted ultimate authority twice. This was crucial, as these events happened during the second generation of the Republic, and it was the deeds of the second and third generation after the founding of the Republic that were the ones that truly solidified the belief and generational tradition of the system, which would come to be one of the most influential in human history. One can easily see how, had Cincinnatus chosen to exploit his position and his popularity, as the vast majority of world leaders have done throughout history, history itself, as we know it, might have been vastly different. And now for some bonus facts. Cincinnatus as a role model had many imitators throughout his time, some more successful than others. Sulla. Continuing with Rome during the late Republic, the political Sulla was, let's say, controversial to say the least. You know that retired authoritarian Navy SEALs commander from any movie? Well, multiply this by 10, add some crazy slaughtering frenzies, and there you have it. However, in 79 BC, after putting order to the Roman Empire and having been dictator since 81 BC, he resigned. His supporters would like to compare this to Cincinnatus, but it is a rather different situation, seeing as he did not step down to resume a simple life, but rather to write his memoirs in a fancy resort. Plutarch states that he retired to a life of luxury where he consorted with actresses, harpists, and theatrical people, drinking with them on couches cultures all day long. So rather than stepping down to a simple life, it was more of a retirement package filled with partying and bliss without the cares, intrigue, and dangers that come with being dictator of Rome. In another contrast, his reforms did not ultimately make the impact he had hoped, and their results were completely thrown over after his death. The empire was founded just a few decades later. Diocletian. Another controversial Roman leader, now in the not-so-brand-new Empire edition, marks Diocletian. Ruling as emperor from 284 to 304 AD, Diocletian achieved what few did during the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. He not only survived long enough to establish political reforms, but actually managed to stabilize the empire for the time being. In 305 BC, he did what no Roman emperor had done before. He abdicated voluntarily and retreated to his palace on the Dalmatian coast, now the historic core of modern-day Croatia's city of Split, where he famously tended to his vegetable gardens. Not even lasting the duration of his retirement until his death in 311 AD, Diocletian established tetrarchy, the splitting of the empire among 4 rulers, collapsed into renewed chaos, and in 308 he was asked to return to power to help fix it. To this he replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggesting that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." While at first this might seem like the perfect comparison to Cincinnatus, it should also be stated that the reason for his retirement was first and foremost Diocletian's failing health and wish to live out his last days peacefully rather than dealing with the political intrigue of the day. In fact, in contrast to Cincinnatus, Diocletian's attitude can be seen more as abandoning the empire in a time of great need, something even the 80-year-old Cincinnatus was unwilling to do. George Washington. Skipping ahead hundreds of years and a vast number of governing changes in the Old World, the American nation appeared in the world scene with a tempo. One of the most peculiar characteristics of it was the idea of a blend of republic and democracy, with a small hint of dictator thrown in, but all carefully balanced to try and produce a system of government blending the best of human governing systems while mitigating the downsides. Today it might seem trivial, but with very few exceptions, like say the Netherlands, at the time Western countries had a king figurehead with varying degrees of authority, even in cases where parliamentarianism had a long tradition, as was the case in England. For many, this experiment of reviving a political system based on ancient Rome was seen as weird, even eccentric. One of the many concerns was the stability of the system. Would Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and someone vastly popular with the general public and politicians alike, step down after victory? Well, no, of course he wouldn't. He'd become a king, or something amounting to the same position, just using a different title, and well, that's not actually what happened somewhat remarkably. He left office. Paralleling Cincinnatus, he left office because he respected the Constitution and the experiment that was this new form of government, a fact that demonstrated, among other qualities, civic virtue and modesty of character. In a final appearance in uniform, he gave a statement to Congress, "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to his holy keeping." It is difficult to imagine today, but stepping down after his presidential term was a sensation. Seeing the counterexample of, say, Napoleon crowning himself emperor or other personalities who would do anything to remain in power, Washington's resignation was acclaimed at home and abroad, and showed a skeptical world that the new republic might just not degenerate into chaos or something completely different and more familiar to the world at the time. The parallels with Cincinnatus are obvious and were made even then. After the fact, a society of veterans of the American Revolutionary War, the Society of Cincinnati was founded with the motto Omnia Requignit Servi Republicarum. He relinquished everything to save the republic. The first major city to be founded after the war was aptly named Cincinnati, which is the genitive case of Cincinnatus, meaning belonging to that of Cincinnatus.
In William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, Caesar mocks the soothsayer's earlier prediction to beware the Ides of March. Later, Caesar says the Ides of March have come to point out the supposed dreaded day did not bring disaster. The soothsayer responds with a prophetic point, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." Shortly thereafter, Caesar is stabbed many times over by conspirators in the Senate, including by his good friend Marcus Brutus. As he lies dying, Caesar mumbles those infamous last words, "Et tu, Brute?" Then falls Caesar.
What often gets lost in popular history is that this is just a play, not an actual accurate portrayal of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Like any modern-day movie, this was Shakespeare taking considerable literary and creative license with a real event. Caesar's last dying breath was not et tu, Brute, as even some before Shakespeare had claimed. However, it is accurate that Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, which is March the 15th on today's calendar. So, what really happened on this day? Rome in 44 BCE was a city bubbling over with tension. Several years earlier, civil war had begun when Pompey-led factions of the Senate asked Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Why did this spark a war? By the Cornelia Majestatis law, governors of Roman provinces, pro-magistrates, were not allowed to bring any part of their army within Italy itself, and if they tried, they automatically forfeited their right to rule even in their own province. The only ones who were allowed to command soldiers in Italy were consuls or praetors. Caesar knew to return without his army at his back, which was what was required given the political climate at the time, would be exceptionally risky. And so he had to decide whether the risk was greater to bring his army or to go alone. As then Roman aristocrat Marcus Caelius Rufus aptly summed up, the closer we come to this inevitable clash, the more apparent the danger. At the heart of the issue is this. Pompey declares he won't allow Caesar to be elected consul unless Caesar relinquishes control over his army and provinces. Caesar, on the other hand, is convinced his status is threatened if he gives up his troops. So now their scandalous liaison isn't stepping behind the scenes, but exploding into full-scale war. It should be noted here that shortly before this, Caesar did make an offer to the Senate that he would disband his army on the condition that Pompey do the same. The Senate even voted on the issue, with 370 votes for accepting Caesar's terms and 22 against. Ultimately, however, Pompey and some of the 22 went against this vote, and he refused to go along with the plan. Not long after, the Senate declared Caesar a public enemy. Negotiations nonetheless continued, with Caesar again making the same offer, but it was rejected. Later he offered that they'd let him keep one legion and allow him to govern Illyria, which is the Balkans today. He would disband the rest of his legions. That offer was likewise shot down, in large part due to speeches against it given by Cato the Younger. This all finally led to Caesar deciding the safer bet for himself was to march on Rome. Shortly before the news hit Rome that Caesar was coming with an army, many of the senators, along with the consuls G. Gladius Marcellus, L. Cornelius Lentulus Crus, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, aka Pompey, they fled. Rome was under the impression that Caesar was bringing nearly his whole highly experienced army to Rome, which would have massively outnumbered the forces they had there. They had not dreamed that he'd be so bold to strike with a lesser force. Instead, he was just bringing one legion, largely due to speed's sake and a bit of a gamble by Caesar. You see, while Pompey had 2 legions at his command, one of them, the 15th Legion, was formerly Caesar's and had been swindled out of his hands by the Senate and given to Pompey not long before. The Senate had requested the use of a legion, but then when the legion arrived and was put in Pompey's hands, they cancelled their plan to use it against the Parthians and simply put the legion under Pompey's direct control. Thus, Caesar thought this legion might just end up turning on Pompey and fighting for him instead. Although it's noteworthy that later Caesar was unable to turn them against Pompey when they did begin to meet in battle. At the same time Caesar was marching on Rome with the one legion, he'd also organized a couple of others to join him, and even more to move into strategic locations, close enough to join him if necessary, but also in positions to block support troops getting to Pompey. Had he actually waited to gather his forces at once, it would have given Pompey time to bring as many legions to Rome, as well as to raise more in the interim. A few years later, largely thanks to Pompey struggling to raise new forces of his own, thanks in part to Caesar's reputation for cruelty against those who opposed him on the battlefield and his ever-growing reputation as a commander, Caesar defeated Pompey, with the older one-time friend and teacher being executed by Egypt's king in 48 BCE. The victor returned to Rome and was declared dictator for 10 years. However, Caesar stocked the Senate with allies, and he was ultimately named dictator for life. Of course, this did not sit well with many Roman citizens, elites, or those who were not Caesar supporters in the Senate. While they had endured Sulla as dictator not long before, a dictator for life was a bit too close to king in the eyes of many.
To put the gravity of this designation in perspective, kings ruled Rome prior to the founding of the Republic by Lucius Junius Brutus. Lucius Brutus, ancestor of the more famous Brutus of Et Brute fame in roughly 509 BC, summoned the Roman people to vote for the overthrow and exile of the monarchy, an act of rebellion sparked by the rape of a Roman noblewoman and Brutus's kin Lucretia by one Sextus Tarquinius, who in turn was the son of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, who just happened to also be the king of Rome. After the monarchy was successfully deposed, one of Brutus's first acts was supposedly to get the people to swear an oath that never again would a king rule in Rome. Unsurprising from this, in the years leading up to 44 BCE, as described in Barry Strauss's book The Death of Caesar, the story of history's most famous assassination, several other Caesar assassination plots were thwarted before they were carried out. Nonetheless, the dictator wasn't shaken despite the number of enemies that he was accumulating. He didn't help matters with his behavior though. For instance, in either December 45 BCE or January 44 BCE, the Senate voted on formally presenting honors to Caesar. As Caesar sat in front of the temple of Mother Venus, the Senate marched to him, expecting to be greeted. Despite etiquette calling for Caesar to stand, he did not, even making jokes about the senators and rejecting their gift. This, of course, did not sit well with the ruling class. However, it should be noted that according to Plutarch, Caesar would later blame his failure to rise and his behavior on his frequent sickness. Long claimed to have been seizures, but that may not actually be the case, as we'll get to shortly. This resulted in him becoming, to quote Plutarch, speedily shaken and whirled about, bringing on giddiness and insensibility. Another noteworthy incident took place shortly afterward when a crowd greeted Caesar as Rex, Latin for king, a major no-no in Roman politics as previously mentioned. On this one, according to Dio, two tribunes, Gaius Epidius Marulus and Lucius Acestius Flavus, had the person believed to have started the chant arrested. Caesar was supposedly furious for what he thought to be poor treatment of the person and ultimately saw to it that the two tribunes were stripped of their titles. Another incident occurred during the Lupercalia festival, in which fertility is celebrated. Mark Antony presented Caesar with a diadem, essentially a crown. While many in the crowd sat in stunned silence, Caesar refused it. Antony tried again, and this time Caesar said, "Jupiter alone of the Romans is king." This got a huge amount of applause from the crowd. Later, Caesar made sure it was recorded that he refused this crown. Whether this was a staged event to try and convince everyone that Caesar had no interest in being king, despite working hard at acquiring all the powers one normally associates with a king, or not, with more and more incidents of Caesar being compared to a king, the ruling class were restless. Many among them saw Caesar as a power-hungry tyrant who needed to be stopped before it was too late. While Shakespeare gives Brutus and Cassius the role as lead conspirators in the downfall of Caesar, it should also be noted that outside of Plutarch, who wrote his account almost a century and a half after Caesar's death, most other ancient sources list another as the key conspirator of the trio. This includes the earliest account, written by Nicholas of Damascus within a few decades of the event, naming Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who Shakespeare incorrectly called Decius, as the most important of the three in organizing Caesar's death. Decimus was a high-ranking general and close friend of Caesar, and was perhaps the man that Caesar trusted the most of the three, and the only one of the trio that supported Caesar throughout his war with Pompey. It isn't clear today why Decimus turned on his friend. Speculation abounds on this, with some believing that he was angry at having been passed over for a promotion, or that he felt he'd been disrespected, such as when Caesar broke tradition and allowed some of his other lieutenants to conduct triumphal parades. But he did not allow Decimus the same honor after Decimus's great victories in Gaul. Or it could just be that he was jealous of Caesar. Whatever the case, it was Decimus, a man who was one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, even through the previous war with Pompey, who made sure Caesar went to the portico of Pompey that fateful day. As for Brutus, while Shakespeare depicts him as something of a son to Caesar, this is in fact a bit of misrepresentation. While Brutus was technically an ally of Caesar, this was only
only after being given a large amount of money and a posh political appointment to buy that allegiance. Directly before this, unlike Decimus, he had been Caesar's enemy, fighting alongside Pompey during the Civil War. On top of that, about a year before the assassination, Brutus divorced his wife and married his cousin Porcia, who was the daughter of Cato the Younger, a recently deceased enemy of Caesar's who had killed himself rather than live under Caesar's rule. That said, it should be noted that during the war, Caesar had specified that Brutus, if captured, should be brought in alive, unlike certain others. But why he did this isn't fully clear given Brutus's actions. It has been speculated that this may have been out of affection for Brutus's mother, who was formerly Caesar's mistress. Some have further speculated that Brutus was in fact the son of Caesar and that Caesar knew it, but this would have put Caesar fathering Brutus at the age of 15. Not impossible, of course, but most historians think unlikely, and there is no documented evidence to back this claim up. As for Cassius, he was a senator and likewise an opponent of Caesar's during the war with Pompey, as well as being known to chafe under Caesar's rule. So this brings us to the soothsayer in Shakespeare's play. There is no record of any individual saying the words, "Beware the Ides of March." It does appear, however, that Caesar was warned that his life was in danger for a 30-day period ending on March the 15th, not just in danger on the Ides of March. This warning came from a haruspex by the name of Spurina. This, however, was an easy prediction that was likely no news to Caesar given the political climate. Spurina's access to the elites of Rome also ensured that he was just as well acquainted with the rumors of the conspiracies against Caesar. Even the 30-day number was mostly a no-brainer. Everyone knew that Caesar was to embark Rome on March the 18th, which meant that an attempt on his life needed to be done before that day. Once Caesar was off campaigning, if he was successful in those campaigns, his popularity with the people would only grow, and surrounded by his army, there would be little chance to safely get rid of him directly for some time. And so it was that shortly before his death, Decimus convinced Caesar to change his mind on his plans to skip the Senate session on the 15th. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had been insisting that Caesar keep a low profile before his upcoming military campaign, and particularly that he avoid the Senate meetings where he'd be vulnerable as only senators were allowed inside and Caesar would be unarmed. As Nicholas of Damascus writes, his friends were alarmed at certain rumors and tried to stop him from going to the Senate House, as did his doctors, for he was suffering from one of his occasional dizzy spells. His wife, Calpurnia especially, who was frightened by some visions in her dreams, clung to him and said that she would not let him go out that day. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators who was then thought of as a firm friend, came up and said, "What is this, Caesar? Are you a man to pay attention to a woman's dreams and the idle gossip of stupid men, and to insult the Senate by not going out, although it has honored you and has been specially summoned by you? But listen to me. Cast aside the forebodings of all these people and come. The Senate has been in session, waiting for you since early this morning." Beyond Decimus goading him into going, it's also significant to note that Caesar may not at this point have been in his right mind. While it's traditionally stated, as previously noted, that Caesar suffered from the occasional seizure, this may not have actually been what was happening, despite Caesar himself claiming such. Caesar played up the morbus comitalis angle, owing to the fact that those who suffered from epilepsy were thought to be touched by the gods during their episode, with the condition called by Hippocrates the sacred disease because of it. However, researchers Dr. Francesco Galassi and Houghton Ashrafian posit that Caesar's actual symptoms, including dizziness, headaches, limb weakness, and sudden falls, seem more closely in line with suffering from transient ischemic attacks, also known as mini-strokes. Beyond the symptoms more lining up with this, it's also noted that rather than being a lifelong malady, his condition did not pop up until later in life, which would actually be a very rare thing for epilepsy. From this, it is speculated that the supposed episode that occurred shortly before the Senate meetings may have seen Caesar not thinking as rationally as he otherwise might have. And indeed, given the rumors, and Caesar himself knowing any attempt on his life, if it came at all, would come around this time, it seems odd that he did choose to go that day. Whatever his state of mind, Caesar made his way to the Senate on the so-called Ides of March, essentially the divide or middle day of March, signifying the midpoint of the month, which was the 13th in most months at this time, excepting March, May, July, and October.
Contrary to many depictions, he did not, however, go to the Senate House, as it was being renovated at the time, according to Plutarch, nor did he go to Capitoline Hill, as Shakespeare said. Rather, he went to the portico of Pompeii, where the conspirators were putting on gladiatorial games at the theatre and the Senate was convening. Here, once again, we see Decimus playing a key role in that he provided the gladiators, not just for the show, but so that they'd be nearby if the conspirators needed them for protection after the assassination. Soon after his arrival, several senators approached Caesar, seeming to discuss important matters with him. They formed a perimeter around Caesar, not just to get close to attack him from all sides, but also to make sure that no senators who supported Caesar could come to his end before he'd been dealt a fatal blow. Outside, Mark Antony was being distracted by Gaius Trebonius. A seasoned soldier and a strong supporter of Caesar, Antony could have potentially foiled the plan, or at least made it much more risky for the conspirators if the two great soldiers fought back to back. This perhaps would have allowed some of the other former soldiers turned senators that Caesar had strategically put in place the time needed to come to his aid before the deed was done. And indeed, we know that at least two of the senators, Gaius Calvisius Sabinus and Lucius Marcius Censoronius, attempted to aid Caesar, but could not get to him fast enough. Inside their togas, the conspirators had hidden daggers. Caesar reportedly seemed suspicious of their approach, but an old friend, Tullius Cimber, came up to him with a petition. Upon reaching Caesar, he grabbed Caesar's toga, causing Caesar to exclaim, "Ista quidem vis est?" Why this violence? Caesar very quickly got his answer as daggers were produced and he began to be stabbed. That said, unlike Shakespeare's play, Caesar, a great fighter himself, fought back, including severely injuring at least one participant, Casca, with a stylus. Caesar also tried to escape, but tripped and fell, where he was an easy target on the ground. But he did not die in the arms of Brutus, and he did not say "etu Brute" as far as any historical account notes. Historians agree that Brutus was there and did stab Caesar, but there is no indication that he was the last person to do so, or that Caesar placed any special significance on Brutus being one of the attackers. As for what Caesar actually said as he lay there dying, most historical accounts seem to indicate that it was nothing at all, or at least that nothing was recorded. Once the deed was done and death was near, he simply covered his face with his toga, speculated to have been an act to preserve his dignity as he lay dying, ironically enough, near a statue of Pompey. After Caesar's assassination, there was initial hope that Rome would once again become a republic. Instead, it fell back into the hands of an all-encompassing leader in less than 2 decades. That was Emperor Octavian, Caesar's nephew, and one of the most influential rulers in history in terms of shaping aspects of the future. In other words, Caesar's assassination more or less had the opposite effect as was intended. But for Shakespeare, it was great source material for his based-on-a-true-story play, as with so many films today, not tending to bother too much with accuracy. Now for some bonus facts. Speaking of the Ides of March, Shakespeare, and assassinations, the three brothers, John Wilkes, Junius Brutus Jr., and Edwin Booth, all critically acclaimed actors of their day, only once all three appeared in the same play together. That was in a portrayal of Julius Caesar in 1864, with John Wilkes playing Mark Antony, Junius taking the role of Cassius, and Edwin playing Brutus. The funds from that performance were donated to erect a statue of William Shakespeare in Central Park, just south of the promenade, and the statue is still there to this very day. What makes the story of the Booth brothers even more interesting is that it turns out Edwin Booth once saved Abraham Lincoln's son's life, as recounted by Robert Todd Lincoln himself in a letter to the editor of Century magazine, Richard Gilder, in 1909. The exact date of the event is unknown, but it apparently took place sometime around late 1863 to early 1865 at the Jersey City Railroad station, shortly before the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. Robert Lincoln recounted the tale as follows. The incident occurred while a group of passengers were late at night purchasing their sleeping car places from the conductor, who stood on the station platform at the entrance of the car. The platform was about the height of the car floor, and there was, of course, a narrow space between the platform and the car body. There was some crowding, and I happened to be pressed by it against the car body while waiting my turn. In this situation, the train began to move, and by the motion, I was twisted off my feet and had dropped somewhat with my feet downward into the open space, and was personally helpless when my coat collar was vigorously seized and I was quickly pulled up and out to a secure footing on the platform. Upon turning to thank my rescuer, I saw it was Edwin Booth, whose face was of course well known to me, and I expressed my gratitude to him, and in doing so, called him by name.
Edwin Booth was a strong supporter of Lincoln and a Unionist, something which had put a wedge in he and his brother's relationship. In fact, when Edwin informed his brother he had voted for Lincoln during his second presidential run, Wilkes Booth supposedly became rabid and asserted his belief that Lincoln would soon set himself up as a king of America, the favorite trope of a surprising number of people even today whenever the person in power isn't #their leader. As for Edwin, he apparently remained ignorant of whose life he had saved until a few months later when he received a letter from Colonel Adam Bedeau, a friend of Booth's who Robert Lincoln had recounted the tale to. Both Robert Lincoln and Bedeau were members of General Ulysses S. Grant's staff at the time. After the assassination, Edwin Booth saw his famed family name ruined. He lost his brother, lost his president, whom he had staunchly supported, and nearly lost his career due to his association with his brother, all in one day, and with none of it due to anything that he had done. It was reported by his friends that he was brought stricken to the ground, and only with time and the aid of his friends taking turns keeping a close watch on him in the coming months did he begin to make a recovery. He eventually made a successful return to the stage in January of 1866, about 8 months after the assassination. It was acknowledged that the knowledge that Edwin had saved the president's eldest son's life gave him some comfort going forward with his life. Interestingly enough, this particular Booth brother saving the life of Lincoln's son came potentially close to thwarting the assassination. You see, Robert Lincoln was invited to the theater the night his father was shot, but turned down the invitation and reportedly went to visit his friend, the president's private secretary, John Hay. This is something Robert Lincoln would regret for the rest of his life, owing to the fact that had he accepted the invitation, he would have been sitting in the back seat next to the door at the theater, being the youngest member of the party, and thus John Wilkes Booth would have had to get past him to get to Abraham Lincoln. Robert would have seen the gun in Booth's hands, and between those two facts, he may well have been able to thwart the assassination. Of course, it might not have as well, resulting in Robert having to witness the assassination. This would have been noteworthy for him, as he was later present and a witness at the assassination of US President Garfield in 1881, at the time serving as the Secretary of War. Further, he was present when President McKinley was shot in 1901. Because of the fact that he was either present or close to 3 presidential shootings, Robert Lincoln eventually began turning down all invitations, with one exception to be in the presence of any presidential figure, once stating, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me, because there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." The one exception was at the dedication to the Lincoln Memorial in 1922, where President Harding was present, as well as former President Taft.
A common idea about the ancient Romans is that they were a paragon of rationality in government, learning, and military organization. This idea primarily stems from Renaissance and Enlightenment era stereotypes about the Romans and the Greeks. But in reality, they did more than a few things that don't match up to that preconception. Most pertinent to the topic at hand today, the ancient Romans kept sacred chickens they let decide countless major events, helping to guide their civilization and ultimately shape human history. Yeah, we didn't misspeak. Chickens. So, how did one of humanity's most enduring and enlightened civilizations come to allow the thing you eat for dinner to decide their major ongoings in a legally binding way? Since the regal period of Rome, when Rome had a king, divination rituals were central to the Roman government and religion. Rome traces back many of its native divination rituals to its legendary founder Romulus. We don't know if Romulus actually existed, but the semi-legendary period he comes from explains why Romans looked to divination as an important function of the state. Romulus was one of the 7 legendary kings, and the earliest priesthood is built around the powers of those kings diffusing into the Senate and the priestly colleges. The Etruscans, Rome's northern neighbors, were considered experts in divination, and the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, was himself Etruscan. The Etruscan rule ultimately mingled their divination and religious rituals in with the Romans, and thus when Tarquinius was overthrown in 509 BCE, the Etruscan priests responsible for divination in the king's court were retained by the Senate. These were the haruspices, and they are distinct from the Roman divinatory priests, the augurs. As for the College of Priests, a college was marked by all the priests taking part in the same duties and rituals. The colleges were also embedded in the Senate and the ruling class. The Senate that ruled Rome during the Republican era was in turn recruited from the elites of Rome, or the patricians. The patricians came from a set number of families that continued to dominate Roman politics well into the imperial era. We know based on surviving lists of priests that they were almost always drawn from serving senators, especially in the colleges. It's also important
important to note that priests in Rome were not professional priests, in the sense that they almost always had other jobs, usually, as alluded to, in politics as senators, but also in the military and business. It wasn't until the 4th century BCE that the colleges began to recruit prospects from the plebeian class, and even then, they were from the elite end of the plebs. So, why did they choose chickens to shape the world? Well, in a word, Jupiter. Jupiter was worshipped as the chief deity in the regal era. Romulus was considered to be the first augur, and augurs read signs for Jupiter's support, called an auspice, hence our modern word auspicious, meaning conducive to success or a sign of future success. Since Jupiter was associated with thunder and the skies, a good indication of his will was in the flight of birds. Thus, augurs like Romulus and his descendants watched for things like where and how birds flew in the skies. These rituals were held by the kings and later the Senate to understand Jupiter's will when it came to important decisions. As for the nuts and bolts of it, the birds flew within a space outlined in the sky and the ground by the augurs, who would delineate what space was sacred and the boundaries of the city. They also designated temples and other sacred spaces, and as a brief aside, it's from that duty we get our word for inauguration. In any event, whether it was reading bird signs or delineating sacred spaces, an auspice is a sign with a permanent effect. The observation of an augur was binding, as it was considered a direct form of communication from Jupiter. As you might have guessed from all of this, a position as an augur set one up to have a rather good and powerful life. So this all brings us to the chickens. As birds, chickens were also considered messengers of Jupiter. Now, you might be wondering, most birds can fly up into the sky, so it makes sense for birds to be messengers of a sky god. But why chickens, who, while they can fly on an extremely limited basis, or maybe more aptly leap into the air with style, soaring into the sky isn't exactly within their natural capability? Well, first, it is true that even in Republican times, chickens were still as relatively flightless as they are now. So, we don't know with hard evidence why chickens in particular were used, though various hypotheses have been put into place. Most prominently, we have the simple fact that chickens are a little easier to keep and maintain than other birds who might need their wings clipped or the like to get them to stick around. Thus, using chickens may have simply been a practical measure despite their relatively flightless nature, making them seemingly less in tune with the thunder god than their high-soaring brethren. Whatever the case, we know the chickens were raised in temples by the augurs. Of course, you may now be spotting the issue of if the way the birds flew and that sort of thing was how they divined Jupiter's will, well, how did chickens help here? While they didn't fly, the augurs had a way to divine Jupiter's will through them. They fed the chickens, and based on how they ate, a sign can be read. This ritual, which technically could have used any bird, is called tripudium, and it is surprisingly important throughout the Republican era. As to how it worked, in an oversimplified nutshell, if the chicken ate and dropped its feed while eating, it was a good sign and support of the thing. If a sacred chicken refused to eat, it was considered an ill omen. At first, the ritual was supposed to be divinatory in the sense that it could read the future. This is attested to in the works of later Republican writers like Cicero, one of our main sources for the duties of augurs and the sacred chickens. By his time, the ritual was used to seek the approval of Jupiter for an action, at least according to Cicero. As alluded to, the sign as an auspice became binding as Jupiter's will became known to the augur. Given the binding nature of things, it is perhaps not surprising that augurs were not permitted to perform a tripudium without a magistrate's authorization. A magistrate was an elected official from the patrician class, and only they could call on these rituals. This can happen at home with the Senate during a military campaign, or even on warships, as one story we'll delve into shortly will discuss. It's also worth noting here that according to Cicero, most magistrates were either augurs or attended so many Senate sessions that augury was intimately familiar to them. Even if its magistrate was never an augur, he had enough knowledge of the practice to know what he was doing. As for the ritual itself, the augurs carried out the rituals, but they were assisted by Polari, or literally, the chicken men. Chicken men were the plebeians who actually took care of the chickens, fed them as part of the ritual, and helped the augur recognize signs. It seems that at first their role was taken up by other augurs, but somewhere in the transition from early to late Republic, the augurs, no doubt getting tired of taking care of pooping smelly birds, left a lot of their duties to plebeians, who became the chicken men. Despite being plebeians, the chicken men held some power in the ritual, such as being able to call out a sign to be interpreted by the augur, a small but important power, given that Rome's religious rituals required perfect execution to count. A successful ritual, whether it be birdwatching or the tripudium, required no interferences or other omens. These interferences or unexpected happenings during a ritual are called vitium, which can be as simple as the
the attending chicken man letting out a fart or a lightning bolt coming out of nowhere. If no vitium interrupts the August ritual, the auspices can be taken and become binding. To further illustrate the plebeian chicken men's power, the chicken men were occasionally accused of controlling parts of the rituals to manufacture Jupiter's will. For example, Cicero accused the chicken men of deliberately ignoring certain signs by simply not looking at the birds if they felt they were acting a certain way. They also were sometimes accused of purposefully starving the sacred chickens so as to get a positive outcome, as when the chickens eat enthusiastically, they are more likely to drop their food, which is auspicious. Because of the fact that the entire system is more or less hinged on how hungry the chickens were, Cicero, who himself was an augur for about a decade between 52 to 43 BCE, went as far as to say real divination, as in seeing the future, had already died out in Rome by this time. Nevertheless, during his time in the late Republic, there was a boom of divination manuals and other aids for augurs, but very little of that literature survives except for Cicero's writings. Of course, Cicero is known to have taken great pride in his position as an augur despite these complaints, and very much had his own agenda when it came to divination and the role of an augur. Like most things about ancient Rome, we either rely on an incomplete source or a very biased one. Just like the starving sacred chickens, we take what we can get. As an example of the shenanigans that could take place in these rituals, we have 293 BCE's Battle of Aquilonia. Consul L. Papirius Cursor wanted to engage the enemy based on a positive tripudium ritual. His chicken man, being overzealous in pleasing the consul, reported an auspice despite the sacred chickens refusing to eat. Papirius went on to announce the auspice until his other chicken men reported their misgivings. They saw their fellow chicken man's lie as extremely grave, a major offense. Demonstrating the lowly standing of the chicken men in society, they didn't report the matter directly to the consul but to his nephew. The nephew got the credit for stopping the ruse rather than the chicken men. As punishment, the consul placed the offending chicken man in the front lines of the coming battle, where he was immediately impaled by a javelin, which was ultimately deemed a divine punishment for misrepresenting the god's will. Of course, sometimes it wasn't the lowly chicken men ignoring the god conduit chickens, but the prominent men themselves. For example, in 249 BCE, at the Battle of Drepana, Publius Claudius Pulcher, commanding the Roman fleet at the time, made a grave mistake. Before attacking the Carthaginian fleet, he called for the tripudium. The attack simply could not go on without the sacred chickens being consulted. The sacred chicken attendants thus took them out of their cages to feed them, but they wouldn't eat. If he had been a pious Roman, Claudius Pulcher would have heeded the sacred chickens and not attacked. Instead, he doubled down on his mockery of the god's will. Upon hearing that the sacred chickens would not eat, he quipped, "They can drink instead," and made them fish food. He then attempted a sneak attack by night, but the Carthaginian fleet managed to in turn sneak around the Roman one and pin them against the shores, with the result being the Carthaginians' greatest naval victory of the entire war, almost completely decimating the Roman fleet. In the aftermath, for almost a decade, Rome didn't even bother trying to create a new fleet, and Publius Claudius Pulcher's act came to be a prominent example of what happens when you ignore the sacred chickens. And as for the man himself, his sacrilege and perceived treason ultimately saw him exiled, all because some chickens wouldn't eat in front of him that one time. Bonus fact. You might at this point be wondering how they decided what chickens were sacred. Well, we really don't know. Well, we don't know if chickens are hatched into sacredness or had sacredness hatched onto them later. We do know that the Romans had no problem eating poultry and their uterine excretions. We know, for example, that Romans ate omelets and ate chickens in a variety of ways, including stuffed. There was even a law passed in 161 BCE to limit poultry consumption to 1 chicken per meal. The Romans were also always trying to find ways to better fatten their chickens by things like modifying their food or castrating roosters.